what is church about? It is to get equipped to go out into the world, right? So if you think about that in terms of the Sabbath, what we should be doing on our Sabbath day is equipping ourselves, resting ourselves, going deeper spiritually, drawing closer to God, because the next 6 days, we're going out to war. Everything that we do in those next 6 days is probably going to be fighting against what we were trying to do on the Sabbath. It's going to be pulling us away from God. We need that day to recenter, to refuel, and to prepare for the next 6 days of battle is how we really should be looking at it.
Hello and welcome back to the Innerfire Podcast. We're glad you're with us today. This is part 2 of our 2-part series on work. Last time we talked about finding the eternal purpose in your work and letting that purpose affect everything that you do while you're at work. Today we want to talk about your work relationships, and we want to talk about keeping work in its rightful place. So that's going to include the Sabbath and holidays and just not working too much. If you're a person who struggles with your relationship with your boss, or if you're not sure how to evangelize or share the gospel with your coworkers, or if you're not sure whether or not you should go into the office on a Sunday, you need to watch this podcast. We're going to be dealing with all those issues and more, and we hope it's a blessing to you. So, welcome back.
Thank you. Work is one of my favorite topics. I've done it all my life. I have been called a workaholic. I do tend to take on too many things. And so, especially when we get to talk about the Sabbath and those kind of things, probably good for me to hear and have a discussion about, because I do work a lot. But work is so integral to our life. It's so important to our life. It's something we really need to understand how to handle and how to deal with. And so hopefully some of the things that we do talk about today will be a different slant than people maybe are thinking about, because we get in a rut and we don't even think about these things. And we do not realize that work is important in our spiritual life. Again, we said it in the last one, but we tend to compartmentalize. Work gets compartmentalized. That's something I go and do and make a paycheck. And we forget the spiritual implications. And so hopefully we'll uncover some of that as we go along today.
Well, let's just start right there at the Sabbath, since you brought it up. In researching for this podcast, I was very convicted by the passages on the Sabbath, because I know that I have neglected it in my life. Now, as I say that, I think we should just take a moment to kind of explain the Sabbath's role in our lives theologically, because it's not the same as it was in the Old Covenant, and a lot of the teaching on the Sabbath is Old Covenant teaching. So I think that might be a good entry point for us.
Yeah, well, if you want to talk about work in the Sabbath, God rested on the seventh day. We know that from Genesis. Why did God rest? God doesn't need to sleep. God doesn't need to take a break. You know what I'm saying? He's God. And so why did he do that? We have to stop and ask ourselves that question. I think he did it to model it for us and to teach us there is a time to reflect on the previous week, to take a respite from labor. And even more important than that is to take a day to focus on God. We don't call it this anymore, but it's the holy day. Sunday should be the holy day where we actually are focused on improving our spiritual lives. That's what the Sabbath should be about. What the Sabbath has become, I'm afraid, is just another day to have fun, another day not to go to work. Saturday and Sunday in our culture today pretty much look the same, except that a small minority of us actually go to church on Sunday morning. And then after that, we treat it just like a Saturday for the most part. When I was small, nobody cut their grass on Sunday. Nobody went fishing on Sunday.
Nobody went hunting.
Nobody went hunting. We went to church and then we rested. We spent time with family. What we probably should have been doing is spending more time in the Word in the afternoon, having spiritual discussions, talking about those things. But it's just morphed into, like I said, it's just another Saturday. It's another day off where we find do our own thing and pleasure ourselves. And what I would say is, if you look at how we spend our time, and people aren't going to want to hear this, but pleasure has become a god to us. And we are constantly seeking out new and better and improved ways to entertain and pleasure ourselves. And we forgot that when we're not working, especially on the Sabbath, we need to be working on our spiritual life. We're working in the physical during the week. It's very difficult to, depending on what kind of work you do, but if you've got a work that's mentally engaging, it's very difficult to be aware of God's presence or to focus on God because you're having to answer questions, communicate with people. You know what I'm saying? The mind can only do one thing at a time. And so we can't work on spiritual things too well during the work week. But on the Sabbath, we've got that time, or we should take that time. So that's where I think we're missing the mark. And I know you probably got some scriptures there for us, but what are your thoughts?
Well, the first thing is I want to clarify something you said. So the Sabbath is Saturday, not Sunday. The Sabbath as
the Old Covenant Sabbath, yes.
Old Covenant Sabbath is Saturday. Now, we generally observe the Sabbath on Sunday. Some people will say that when Jesus rose from the dead, which was a Sunday, which we call the Lord's Day, which that is the basis upon which we worship on Sunday. For those who don't know, we do it in weekly memorial of Christ's resurrection. Some people will say that that day is the new Sabbath, that the Sabbath is just as what it was in the Old Testament now, it's just now on Sunday. I don't think there's great scriptural support for that. What I will say, my view of it anyway, is that the Sabbath is a part of the Old Covenant ceremonial law. And in that sense, we are no longer bound to it. However, there is great wisdom in the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man and not for the Sabbath. If we were wise, we would observe the Sabbath because the Lord has put it in place for our benefit. I don't know if the people just saw that. I just blew a little bubble out of my mouth there.
I thought it was a bug flying through. Well, I think I don't think you need to be legalistic about the Sabbath. And you mentioned in the intro there, should you go into the office on Sunday? Well, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. So which day of the week we take it on is not critically important, I don't think. Under the Old Covenant, yes, it was Saturday. That was the set aside designated day. I don't think that's the case anymore. But we do need a Sabbath. Maybe your work schedule is that you work, Sunday through Thursday. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, pick Friday or Saturday, make that your Sabbath. What would that look like? It would mean taking that day and resting your body physically, mentally, shutting out the things of the world, focusing on God. And not doing that just for 10 minutes and then going about your day, but taking the day to do it, is what we really need to do. And so I think that's what people need to think about. I want to make the point of what Jesus, if you look at Jesus' model, he often did things on the Sabbath that really angered people. Yeah. The number one thing that he would do on the Sabbath is heal someone. Mm-hmm. There's several examples of that in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And, what he was doing was was making a point of what we just said. The Sabbath was made for man, and we can do good on the Sabbath. We can honor God on the Sabbath. Healing someone is not wrong. Feeding yourself. We went through the field and they gathered some corn so that they could eat. And he got raked over the coals for that one. So we don't need to be legalistic about it, but if we take seriously the admonition to be holy as I am holy, we need a day to do that. And that is what the Sabbath really is about, is making us more holy, focusing on God so that we can be more like him.
Mm-hmm. And it would be easy for someone to say at this point, oh, the Sabbath was made for man. Thanks, God. I'm going to go have a great time. Well, while the Sabbath is absolutely an enjoyable life rhythm for a Christian, it's not a fun day. It's not just observe a Sabbath. What he told his people in the Old Testament was observe a Sabbath unto the Lord. And similar to the other times of rest that he commanded, the rest creates space to give God your undivided attention. You mentioned that the things of daily life can distract us from God. I would say ideally, those things can be integrated into our relationship with God. We can do them in such a way that acknowledges God. In all thy ways acknowledge him is what the proverb says. But even if you do that very well, you will still benefit from a time in which you do nothing but focus on God, invest in your relationship with him. I would say if you do engage yourself in recreational activities or leisurely activities, they ought to be activities that renew and refresh your relationship with God. So I will say, I don't think I've ever hunted on a Sunday, but I do find hunting to be a very spiritually edifying experience, just to be out in nature, to have an extended period of silence. I often find that my mind is drawn to God in those times. Mm-hmm. I think that makes it a good candidate for a Sunday activity. For some people, that is not how they experience hunting. It would not be a good idea for them to do that. So rest on Sunday or the Sabbath, rest intentionally. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Rest is not just doing whatever you want. There is a discipline to rest.
There's definitely a discipline to it, and we are horrible at it in this country. Social media has made it worse. It started back when TV first came out. We're really not good at doing nothing. I know, an idle mind is the devil's workshop or whatever, but not if we're reading the Bible or focused on God or spending that time in prayer or meditation. We don't like those things because we have very short attention spans anymore. Mm-hmm. And we are always wanting something to engage us or to get us thinking. We don't like silence. A lot of people don't even want to ride down the road in their car without turning the radio on. Mm-hmm. And so, I think this is a problem that we as Christians need to deal with in our own lives, to take those times when we have an opportunity for silence and use those to focus on God, to listen to God, to commune, to communicate, to pray, whatever form you want to put it in. But to use those times to build us up spiritually. We just have lost the idea of sitting before God and just resting our mind. We don't have to be thinking about something all the time, trying to solve a problem all the time. For me, what hits me is I want to be accomplishing something. I want to be making something better or doing something. And that's great 6 days out of the week. But on the seventh day, I really need to pause and just sit with God and see maybe if that does not inform what I do for the next 6 days, right? As far as how I spend my time and what I do, and especially inform maybe even how I do at work. And we'll talk about this maybe a little bit more about, work as a mission field and how we should be acting and treating others at work. But one thing I would ask people is, when you talk about the Sabbath or you talk about taking some leisure time, open your Bible and look at Jesus and ask yourself, what did Jesus do for leisure? What did Jesus do for recreation? Every story that I read, where he came across somebody, it never said, Jesus and his disciples were on the way into the arena to watch the gladiators, and they saw a blind man. Did they do that? Did they do things like that? If they did, they're not recorded in the Bible, best I can tell. When Jesus needed to renew himself, he generally got away from the crowd, he got alone, and he prayed.
Yeah.
That's what, recreation is recreation of ourselves. When we go out and do something that engages us physically, mentally, and we just come home exhausted from the activity, we're not recreating ourselves. Maybe we're taking our mind off of reality. That's something we really like to do. We don't want to face the reality of this world. That's why we enjoy TV and movies and things like that. We disengage from reality for a little bit and enter some alternate universe. Seems like this day and time, most of society is wanting to live in an alternate reality. But, when we want to renew and recreate ourselves, silence, alone time, prayer, reading God's word, those are the things that really have an opportunity to recreate us in God's image. We're supposed to be transformed by the word, not to be conformed to the world. That's how we do it. We don't do it by going to a football game or going shopping or whatever it is you do for pleasure. I mean, there's 1,000 things.
The Sabbath is not a time to escape reality. If anything, it's a time to re-engage with reality, to consider the big picture, to give yourself a break from all of the little things, all of the things that are right in front of you, and ponder God himself, ponder eternity. That's what the Sabbath is for. So you kind of got into the word recreation a little bit. How about this one? How about the word amuse or amusement? The prefix or a, meaning not, muse, meaning think or ponder. This is basically what entertainment is. It's a turning off of the mind. And that is the kind of idleness that the devil will work through. Now, I'm going to pick on TV here for a minute. I don't watch that much TV. Courtney and I don't have a TV. And I only bring that up to say, in the recent years, when I do come across a TV and I watch regular network programming, I am jarred by the amount of noise and just stimulus, especially in the commercials. I mean, it's bright colors, it's loud noises, it's music, it's all of these kinds of things. Whatever rest one finds in that is not the kind of rest that we're looking for in the Sabbath. A lot of the same issues with overstimulus are absolutely present online, on YouTube, on social media. I think that a break from those on a Sabbath, and I say this as one who does not necessarily take a break from those on the Sabbath. When I say the Sabbath, I mean the Lord's Day. I think that could absolutely be beneficial.
Well, what I would challenge people is, try what we're saying, and see if you really do this on a Sunday, if that's your day of rest, do this and see if you enter into Monday more energized, both mentally, physically, and spiritually. Here's the thing. What is church about? Well, we're not talking about church today, but let me hit on this. You go back and watch our podcast on church. When you go to church, it is to get equipped to go out into the world, right? So if you think about that in terms of the Sabbath, what we should be doing on our Sabbath day is equipping ourselves, resting ourselves, going deeper spiritually, drawing closer to God, because the next 6 days, we're going out to war. Everything that we do in those next 6 days is probably going to be fighting against what we were trying to do on the Sabbath. It's going to be pulling us away from God. It's going to be wearing us out. It's going to be luring us to our own lust. I mean, whatever. I mean, it's taking us away from God and away from the spiritual person we need to be. We need that day to recenter, to refuel, and to prepare for the next 6 days of battle is how we really should be looking at it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I can imagine there's someone listening to this podcast. Let's say it's a mom of young kids, and she says, okay, you're telling me that I should rest on Sunday, but here's what I have to do on Sunday. I have to get 3 kids dressed up all nice in the morning time, got to get them out of bed, get some breakfast in them, get their clothes on, get them to church in one piece, find out what to do with them while I'm at church, and then when it's over, I got to make sure that they have something to eat, and now mom and dad want to come over. Like, it's just not a restful situation. I would say, to the degree that you have been engaged in spiritual warfare throughout the week, you will experience church as restful. I've said this on the podcast before, but the times in my life when I have been the most engaged in spiritual warfare, when I walk through the doors of the church, I mean, it's like getting in bed at night. You can feel the relief, the comfort of the other believers around you, the light there, having been surrounded by darkness for the whole week. It should absolutely be a restful experience. Now, I've also been on the other side of that. Well, not the other side of that specifically, but I've been a ministry worker before. And when I was in college, I sang in a musical group, and we would perform mostly on Sundays. So what that involved was getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning, going and having a sound check at 7 a.m. Then we would sing at 8 a.m. and maybe 9:30 and then maybe 11. And then by the time that was over, I mean, that was work.
Oh, yeah.
Now, a lot of ministry workers would take a day off, maybe Monday or Thursday or something like that. I couldn't do that. I had to go to class during the week. And what I learned to do when I disciplined myself to do it, and I'm still in this position sometimes, is when I got on the bus to go home after all of that, I would say, okay, from here on is my Sabbath.
All right.
Taking 12 hours of Sabbath, if you can't afford 24 for whatever reason, is better than nothing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so that busy mom that you describe, I think the question would be, what do you do when you get a break from the kids, when the kids go to bed or whatever? We've raised 3 kids. We understand that. It's not going to be ideal, and you certainly shouldn't beat yourself up over that. But I think with kids even, you can get into a rhythm. If you got a 2, 3, and 4-year-old, that's going to be different than if you got a 10, 11, and 12-year-old. Obviously, just different circumstances. there will come a time when things can be slowed down just a little bit. And by the way, you don't have to cater to kids on Sunday. And I would just say in general, I mean, when we're talking about work and busyness, we can overload our schedules. Kids do that to us to a large extent. And I think we let kids participate in too many things these days.
Yeah.
And it overloads our schedules. But I agree with what you're saying. Whatever time you can find, use it for these purposes. Mm-hmm. Don't squander it. Mm-hmm. Don't just rest your mind, but use that time to renew yourself spiritually, because that's what we're really talking about.
Mm-hmm. And I would also say, as a word of encouragement to that mom or dad or whoever is in that position, the biblical model is to do everything that you possibly can the day before. So if that means ironing your kids' clothes and laying them out, cooking a meal, doing some meal prep, putting something in the slow cooker, whatever it takes, anything that you can, any burden you can take off of that day, mm-hmm. you should. And this leads me to another point that I thought of earlier. You mentioned being a little antsy on the Sabbath because you always want to be accomplishing something. That is your personality. You're a very conscientious, industrious person. I am not like that. I tend to be more lower in conscientiousness, lower in industriousness. I have no problem taking leisure. What I have a problem with is accomplishing things. That's what I have to force myself to do. Mm-hmm. This also comes to bear on how we experience the Sabbath, because often I will find myself on Saturday night looking forward to the Sabbath and realizing I don't have everything done. It takes discipline to work those 6 days so that you can rest on the Sabbath. If you're just piddling on those 6 days, the likelihood that you will be able to actually rest and not have a bunch of stuff on your mind, mm-hmm. or not be neglecting something on the Sabbath is low. So rest is a discipline.
Yeah, it's like most things. It requires intentionality. You've got to intend to rest so that you get the other stuff done. Very, very good point. So I think we've kind of covered the Sabbath pretty well.
Yeah.
Giving people some things to think about. There's a verse in Isaiah that I think we could close out kind of our discussion on the Sabbath with. I think it's Isaiah 58:13. If you would read that, as we were preparing for this, I found this verse, and it speaks to what we do on the Sabbath. And I realize, it's Isaiah, but you look at the underlying principle of this verse, and I think it'll kind of encapsulate everything we've been saying.
Yeah, so Isaiah 58:13 says this: "If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly." Yeah, so that's a good vision for what the Sabbath ought to look like.
Yeah, because one of the things that the nation of Israel would do is not honor the Sabbath. That's one of the first things that would go. And so, given that, we need to consider our own ways.
All right. So, with all that said, let's move on to our work relationships. So there are basically 3 kinds of work relationships, and I think we ought to talk about all of them. One is the relationship between your boss and yourself. Then there are relationships with peers or colleagues, and then there are relationships where you are the boss and you have your inferiors. Which one of those do you want to start with?
Inferiors? I wouldn't put it that way.
I believe that is the term. I mean,
your
we say
underlings.
Yeah, your minions, your grunts.
Yeah, your coworkers that you happen to supervise. So let's just start, I think with where most people are, and that is an employee who has a boss. So how do you treat your boss? How do you interact with your boss? And what we're going to say here is not revolutionary. But we need to understand that when we enter into the workplace, we are Christ's ambassador.
Yeah.
We are representing Christ. We're not just there to earn a paycheck. We covered that extensively in the last podcast. We're not just there for ourselves, but we are there representing Christ. And so the interaction we have with our boss should see Christ in us. We should honor them and respect them. It doesn't mean that we don't ever put forth our ideas or engage in a debate with them about how to do something. I think all those are healthy. It'd be no different than a marriage from the standpoint of you should be able to put your ideas on the table and have a discussion about them. But at the end of the day, the boss is the boss. And when they say this is how we're going to do it, then you should honor that and do it that way. And so, I mean, that would be the starting point, I would say. I won't get into necessarily, we know you should work hard. You should be industrious. You should do your work well. We covered some of that in the last podcast as well. But specifically interacting with your boss, just treat them with honor and respect. And if they're not a Christian, then you should be seeking to win them for Christ. If they are a Christian, you should be seeking to bolster their faith, to help them grow in the Lord. That's why we don't need to compartmentalize work. Those things need to be on our mind when we're there.
Right. So to me, there are basically 2 points here. One of them you kind of already touched on when you said that being a good employee doesn't necessarily mean never challenging your boss. And see, I'm going to advocate that we submit to our bosses as the authority that the Lord has placed in our lives. Here's what that does not mean. It does not mean being a kiss up. That is not good for anyone. And basically, we should not flatter. Here's what Proverbs says about one who flatters. A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy. Whoever rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with his tongue. A man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. There is a time when you need to speak up and you need to say, hey boss, I don't think you're going the right direction here. I don't think you have the right idea about this. In order for that to go well, you need to have won their trust. They need to know that you have their best interests at heart. And the way for them to know that is for you to have their best interests at heart. Seek the benefit of the city that you're in, right? If you're working for a company, then your goal should be to cause that company to prosper. My first job, I was a bagger at Mike's Foodland just down the road. And when I took that job, I said to myself, by the time I leave this job, Mike's Foodland should be a more prosperous company for me having worked there, And I had a good relationship with my boss there. No, he was not a difficult boss. I will say I have worked for a boss who a lot of people probably would find difficult. And I kind of created this little principle that I would tell the other people I was working with when they were having struggles, which is that you capitalize on their strengths, because chances are, if you have a boss, they're not completely incompetent. There's a reason that they're there. And you want to figure out what is it that they're so good at, and how can I help them do that the most, and then compensate for their weaknesses. So if there's a place where they're not really that good, they're not really that knowledgeable, that's where you step in and you say, I'm going to make it as if it weren't the case. I'm going to cover that mistake. If you do that, you'll have a good relationship with your boss, and your boss will love you.
Yeah, make your boss look so good that he gets promoted. If he's that kind of a boss, maybe he'll get promoted and go to another job and you won't have to work with him anymore. No, I'm joking. But the attitude that we bring to work, as you said, just should be leaving things better than we found them.
Yeah.
Applying ourselves. As far as kissing up to the boss, what that does really, a person who is doing that is really just saying, I'm a self-centered person. I'm going to do special favors for the boss to put myself in a better position to get more for myself. That doesn't help your relationship. Maybe it helps your relationship with the boss, but it doesn't help your relationship with your peers or anybody that works under you.
It's manipulative. It's, I'm going to make you feel good about yourself so that you then feel good about me. It's inauthentic. That is not the Christian way.
No.
Now, with that said, you should submit to your boss. Now, I've been thinking a lot about submission lately. And here is basically my view of submission in Christianity. Everyone submits to somebody, right? If you're a child, you submit to your mother and your father. They are the authority that God has placed in your life. Well, if you're the mom, you don't have to submit to the kids. You're in leadership over them, but you do have to submit to your husband. He is the authority that God has placed in your life. If you're the husband, you don't have to submit to the kids. You don't have to submit to your wife, but you do have to submit to your church elders. If you're a church elder, then you have leadership over your flock, but you still have to submit to the governing authorities. And the governing authorities have to submit to God. Everyone has someone who they have to submit to. Okay, great. Who doesn't have someone they have to submit to? The only person who is in absolute authority, absolute sovereignty, is God. So when Jesus Christ came to the world, obviously the thing that he's going to do is take his rightful place on the throne. But that's not what he did. Being the only one who was rightfully subject to no one, he made himself subject to everyone. What I'm suggesting is that the Christian position is primarily that of submission and subjection. You should be very suspicious of anyone who is trying to usurp the rightful authority that God has placed over them, whether it be their governing authority, their church authority, their husbands, or their parents. With all of that said, to reflect Christ at work is to submit to your boss the way that Christ submitted. If you are made wrongfully subject at some point, all the better. The Lord sees that, and He's pleased by that. Don't murmur and complain against your boss in spite of his inadequacies. If he has an inadequacy that is just truly unbearable, then you can take it to him. But if you're not willing to take it to him and manifest your frustration in a way that is productive, then it's not important enough for you to talk about it with your friends.
Well, the Word teaches us to submit ourselves one to another, not just to the one that's in authority over us, but as a church body, we should submit one to another. So I like to think, obviously the term submission kind of makes a lot of people just recoil. They're like, I'm not submitting.
But I don't like that. I don't like the fact that conversations of submission are so uncomfortable in this culture. But go ahead.
Well, I think there are a lot of negative connotations to it. It is the word that should be used, and I think it does inform how we should act. The truth of the matter is, I've said on multiple occasions, the Christian life goes against everything that comes natural to us. Go read the Beatitudes if you don't believe that. But that's what Christ teaches us. So yes, it is counter natural, I will say. It's against our natural tendencies to do it. Mm-hmm. If you don't like the word submit, then maybe you like the word serve better. Serve your boss, serve your coworkers, serve your customers, whoever it is that you're interacting with. Always have the mindset of, I'm going to serve this person, which takes yourself out of the center. What I would say about what you were saying about submission too is, I was thinking about as you were saying it, the minute someone thinks they don't have an authority over them that they have to submit to, that is the instant things start to go bad. You can see it in world leaders that they're at the top of the hierarchy, and they're like, I don't have to submit to anybody. What happens? If you look in the Bible, they start thinking they're God themselves.
Right.
And you have little miniature versions of that. If you have a boss that thinks he's untouchable, and he can become the god of his department or whatever, where he just thinks he's the ultimate authority and ruler, and he can just wreak havoc with everybody there. That's not a good position to be in. Even that person, I think you got to remember, hey, I am representing Christ here. I am trying to win that person for Christ. Ultimately, we all submit to God. And if our leaders over us are submitted to God, then they should treat the people that work for them differently. And maybe it's a good time to transition to, if you are the boss, how do you treat those under your authority? And what do you do for them? It's a similar situation, except you are the one who gets to call the shots. You get to make the decisions. You also bear the responsibility for those decisions.
Right.
This is one thing, just backtrack just a second. As far as that decision making and submitting to someone who's over you with authority, oftentimes, and I know this because as I've said before, I've been a boss a lot. Oftentimes the boss has a lot more information about a situation than what you have. And so the decisions they make don't always make sense to you, because you're seeing something from one perspective, they're seeing it from a perspective that has a lot more information. Now, that's not to say that bosses can't get disconnected from what's going on in the real world, and they lose the perspective of the worker, and so they need to take that into account. But just keep that in mind. But if you're the boss, you have to bear the responsibility for the decisions you make. That includes, how you treat your people. If you're a boss and you're representing Christ, you're a Christian, then the focus of what you're doing should be to win your workers to Christ. That should be primary over everything else. And so how do you do that? Well, you live a godly life in front of them. You treat them with respect. And you speak to them with respect. Just because somebody works for us and we have authority over them does not make them any less a human being. And we should treat all human beings with dignity and respect. The thing, whether you're a parent or a boss or whatever, if you're in authority, you don't have to be mean. You don't have to be ugly. You don't have to shout. Your word is the authority. So you can say, pick up that broom and sweep the floor, in a lot of different tones and with a lot of different adjectives, and so you don't have to be ugly. You can be a nice person and tell people what to do, and they still have to do it. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, a good leader does not feel the need to lord his authority over his subjects.
Right.
The kind of leadership that you're talking about, leadership with a gentle hand, servant leadership, that sort of leadership betrays a great amount of security on the part of the boss. A boss who is always yelling, who is always coercing, who is always using some form of compulsion, that is a boss who is not secure in his leadership in his leadership position, in his authority. In fact, I would say compulsion, whether it's coming down from the government or coming from your boss or anything like that, that is to say orders that are delivered under threat, those are a great indicator of something having gone wrong. When you have to force someone to do something, ideally, you create a framework in which everybody wants to do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, if just you and I, if you worked for me.
I do work for you.
Oh, yeah, you do work for me, don't you? I forgot that. You know, but if you were not doing something well, I could say, Andrew, I am sick of you. I am sick of your attitude. You better do this or I'm going to fire you.
Mm-hmm.
All right? I mean, I could take that approach. Or I could say, Andrew, you know, your actions are really not up to our expectations. And here's the standard that we're expecting. Here's what we're looking for you to do. And I just want you to understand that if you don't do that, you're subject to get fired. You know, okay, I said the exact same thing from a meaning standpoint, but I didn't have to yell it. I didn't have to scream it. It's just as true as it either way. Right. And I realize our emotions get in the way. We get angry with people. We get very frustrated with people. But we always have to remember, I am representing Christ. Mm-hmm. That person that I'm dealing with is going to walk away and say, that's what a Christian looks like.
Right.
Do I want to be one? And so we have to keep that in mind in how we deal with people.
Right. Yeah.
Now you're worried about getting fired, aren't you? You lost your train of thought.
Let me think about what I was going to say. On the flip side of this, it's not being a pushover. You don't want to ever compromise the truth or compromise the framework that you have set up. When we talk about leading gently, that's not what we mean. It's the same thing as the employee being frank with the boss. There comes a time when you have to speak uncomfortable truths. And I'll just say, I mean, I'm not a businessman, but it's simply the case that the more truth is able to be uttered in a workplace, the more effective that workplace will be.
Yeah, absolutely. What you can't do is go into a shell. You have to communicate. You know, this is all relationships. Work relationships are no different. If the boss is doing something you don't like, tell him. If the worker is doing something you don't like, tell them. You know, people are not good mind readers. They will fill in the blank and draw their own conclusions. You have to communicate. And you know what I have found in my work career is that when you tell somebody, hey, you're not really meeting the standard that I'm looking for, here's how this needs to be done, and this is my expectation, people usually do it. You know, I mean, yeah, there's some people that don't. Some people are horrible workers, and some people you have to fire or let go. Mm-hmm. But when you lay out the expectation, people will often rise up to that. And, you know, the other thing I would say is if you are the boss, people are never going to be any better than you are. You've got to set the example. Mm-hmm. You know, Christ set the example for us by coming down, taking on flesh, walking amongst us, living life as a man. I mean, how condescending is that for God to do that? You know, what we're asking our employees to do, we should be willing to do. We should never, now maybe they got skills to do something that we don't have. Mm-hmm. That's not what I'm saying, but we should not be forcing the stuff onto them just because we would never stoop that low to do it. We should be willing to do whatever we're asking them to do. We should be working as hard as they are. Mm-hmm. We should be setting the example. You know, that's how it should work.
Mm-hmm. And yes, we should be, well, I might amend your statement a little bit. We should be working as hard as they are. I would say we should be modeling for them how they should work. See, another thing to consider is if you're a boss and you're working 80 hours a week, you're not taking a Sabbath, and you're demanding that of your employees, then you are withholding them from what God has called them to. You need to take a Sabbath, and you need to say, you guys, don't come into work. Don't come into the office on Sunday. You know, you think about the Chick-fil-A's of this world. They're closed on Sunday, right? Their employees don't have to come in that day. It's the leadership communicating to not only the customer, but also the workforce. Mm-hmm. This is important for you. We are not going to create a situation in which you can't take this rest. That's good leadership as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, obviously different people occupy different positions, but I lead a company. Okay, so I own a company, lead a company. So I believe that if I'm going to be in a position where I am actively involved in that company, then the people need to see that I am leading the way with how I conduct myself, which includes the level of effort I'm putting forth to make the company successful, right? If I decide one day, you know what, I'm tired of all this work, it's time for me to do some other things. Well, I believe you don't need to occupy that same position if you are, if you decide, well, I'm just going to work 10 hours a week, I'll come in and I'll just check on the books and all that, but you still want to hold all the same authority and responsibility to other people. I don't think that's how it should work. Mm-hmm. Put somebody into that position that you have previously done, empower them, and give them the responsibility so that the people under them see, okay, this is the new leader. Mm-hmm. And that new leader is working as hard as the old leader worked. Yeah, the old leader is now only working 10 hours a week, but he's not really the one setting the pace for us. He's off doing something else. Right. Because I think if the leader is not as engaged, that's just going to trickle down. I mean, the leader sets the pace, it sets the expectation for everyone else.
Yeah, we're getting into some business practices now, but I think this is important, and I think that this should be heeded even by church leadership, should they listen to this. If you don't do what you just said, it will be done to you. Because, see, you said that the leader is the one who takes responsibility. To me, that's basically the definition of a leader. The leader is the person who the buck stops with. Mm-hmm. They're the person who is ultimately responsible for everything that happens. So if you become disengaged as a leader, you still have the title, but you're not involved with what's going on in the company, there will be some person who cares about the company who does start picking up your slack. And what's going to happen is the other employees are going to start looking to that person because that is the person that can help them. When there is a really strong leader in a group of people, it doesn't really matter who has the title. Mm-hmm. That will become manifest. And I say that also to people who are aspiring leaders. You want to be a leader? Take responsibility for more things that are on your job description. And eventually, you will have the title.
Yeah, and you say we're getting into business practices. Yes, it is a business practice, but I would argue that it is also the biblical model. It's a framework that's laid out in the Bible of how we lead and how we treat others. So, the truth is, the underlying biblical principles are what make a good workplace. I mean, you just go read the literature, you can see the biblical principles, whether it's a secular piece or not, at play. And so, yes, we are talking business, but we're talking about it hopefully in a biblical framework, with the idea that you are there to represent Christ and to win people to Christ ultimately. Yes.
So, let's talk about evangelism at work.
Yes.
This is deeply concerning to me because I see the workplace as one of the most potentially fruitful places for evangelism, and I see evangelism not happening at work. Here's basically what it looks like to me. Someone who's evangelistically minded. At this day and time, I'm going to go ahead and suggest that's probably a pretty spiritually mature person. I find that people who are spiritually mature, they look around them, they notice that they are more spiritually mature than the people around them, and what they say to themselves is, oh, I guess this means I'm called to ministry. So then what happens is all of the spiritually mature people end up working in full-time ministry, and those who are the most evangelistically minded end up being surrounded completely by fellow believers. I see this as a huge problem. I think that we absolutely need spiritually mature, evangelistically minded people in the secular marketplace, because that is where the unbelievers are. You have to go where they are, and I recognize the irony of this as a person who works in ministry. But I think so often of what Larry Warren said when he was on the podcast. He talked about a job that he had and a mentor who encouraged him not to leave that job until he knew that the people around him knew who Jesus was. I think that is so wise, such a great way to look at our jobs. You know, we generally want to move from paycheck to higher paycheck to higher paycheck to higher paycheck as fast as we can without a lot of time spent in any job necessarily. But what about those relationships? You know, can you evangelize to someone who you have no relationship with? Yes, you can. But it is better and more effective to evangelize to those who you do have relationships with. And often, the workplace is where you're going to have those relationships. Don't waste those. Don't let that opportunity pass by you.
Yeah, I think about what Jonathan Matthews said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but you know, you can't sow and you can't reap if you're not in the field. You know, you've got to be out where the unbelievers are to build those relationships and make those relationships. So one thing I would say, I think there is a move that's encouraging in our marketplace today, and that is more marketplace ministry. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm a member of C12, which focuses on business as ministry, building, you know, great businesses for a greater purpose. It's what we're trying to do. But I think there is a move. You know, there's a recognition that the people that come into churches, a lot of the people in the workplace are never going to come into a church, but the people in the churches are going into the workplace. And so when the people that are in the churches go into the workplace, that's where the evangelizing needs to happen.
Yes.
And we just need to be intentional about doing that. You know, in our own business, we do a Tuesday morning devotional. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's optional. People are not forced to come. We don't evaluate people for promotions based on their religious views or anything like that. You know, so we're meeting the laws that our government has laid out that we must abide by. But at the same time, we're not scared to pray. We're not scared to talk about Christ because all those things are doable in the workplace. Your First Amendment rights don't end when you walk through the door of your place of employment. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can't stand out front with a Bible and preach after you get off work, but you can talk to your coworker about what's going on in their lives and give your testimony to them. They cannot prevent that from happening. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you're going around and just beating people over the head all the time, yeah, they can stop that if it's being disruptive to the workplace. But that's not what we're talking about doing. We're talking about identifying needs that people have in the workplace and ministering to those needs. You know, sometimes those are physical needs, but we minister to the physical needs and we gain access to then minister to the spiritual needs.
Yeah.
And so we just need to be aware of those things and don't let fear of some kind of separation of church and state doesn't apply in the workplace. Right? We're not a government. I mean, if you work for the government, okay, that might be a different story. But in the private workplace, you're not required to have. You know, it's not separation of church and private workplaces. You know, it's the government should not be compelling you to be a certain religion. But let me just say this: if you work in a government workplace, you're not compelling the public or forcing on the public to be a certain religion if you discuss the gospel with your coworker.
That's right.
So you still have opportunities even if you're working in a government workplace. Mm-hmm. We just need to be aware and intentional, and don't be fearful about speaking the gospel. And if you have some leeway in your place of business, start a Bible study, a before work Bible study, or a lunchtime Bible study, or prayer, or whatever you're allowed to do. Be intentional and bold in asking for permission to do those things. You know, we have over 75 people that work for us. They're from all different backgrounds. From a religious standpoint, you know, some of them are completely unchurched, different, just all kinds of different people. You know, we're not cookie cutter people. We have the Tuesday morning group, and we're intentional about when we see needs, asking people, can we pray for them? And I realize it's maybe an anecdotal example because we're not, you know, it's not thousands of us. But when we've asked anybody, can we pray for you? We've yet to have anybody turn us down when they're in a difficult situation. And so, you know, be bold in your faith, and you might be surprised at the response you get.
And sometimes being bold is just being honest. If our faith is the most important thing in our lives, then it's going to consume a lot of our attention. And day to day, at any given time, the most important thing that's going on with me is probably some kind of spiritual thing. So then you go into work, let's say the thing is, let's say you're concerned about your lost family member and you're trying to win them to Christ, and that is what you're concerned about. You go into work and it's like, hey Bill, hey John, what's new with you? Well, you know, just working. Be honest with him and just say, you know, honestly, Bill, you know, I'm a Christian and I believe that eternity awaits all of us, and I have a family member who doesn't know the Lord, and I'm trying to win him to Christ right now. That is the true answer, but we're always so scared to give answers like that. Just being honest about what's going on with you can be an excellent doorway into a gospel conversation. What I'm saying is, you don't have to manufacture it.
Right.
You know, if you have a genuine faith and you're willing to talk about it with others, it's just going to come out. The other thing that sorry, you want to?
No, I'm just agreeing with you.
You mentioned caring for the needs of your coworkers. I absolutely endorse that, and it reminds me of the Richard Williams podcast, because he talks about that, doing that, taking opportunities to intentionally care for his employees. And, you know, that's the third podcast that's come to mind since we've been talking here.
Yeah.
And I just want to remind our listeners, when we had a guest-oriented podcast, we intentionally sought out strong believers who were not necessarily in ministry. We did have people who were in ministry on, but it was not a bunch of pastors and everything. Nothing against pastors, but we wanted to help people understand what it looked like to live out your faith in a secular environment.
Yes.
I would strongly encourage our listeners, if they haven't, if they're new with us, go back and listen to those. There's so much good stuff.
Oh, some good stuff in there. Yeah. You can start with a compilation of all the stories.
Yeah.
We have that video out there. If you're not familiar with our podcast, highly recommend that one, because that's some of the best of the best there, and you can kind of get a feel for maybe some of the guests you want to go a little deeper with.
I just want to talk about a couple more things. You mentioned the issue of having a government job.
Yes.
I don't want to talk about separation of church and state too much, because at some point we are going to dedicate a couple of podcasts to politics and civil life specifically, and I think we should save it for that. However, I will say that Courtney just finished a job at the library, which is of course a government-funded establishment. She worked there, our local library, and when she became pregnant, she decided she was going to stop working there at a certain period of time. And we had to think a lot about what evangelism was supposed to look like in that situation, because she was not allowed to make the library a platform for teaching Christianity, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That part I want to leave aside for now, but the part that I don't want to leave aside is what you said. She was not restrained from having those conversations with her coworkers, and she made it her goal. I'm going to kind of brag on her a little bit, but really I'm boasting in the Spirit of the Lord in her, to have some sort of gospel conversation with all of the people who she had a relationship with there before she left. And, you know, I don't think she ever led anyone to the Lord in the kind of traditional sense in which we would think, but I can guarantee you, if you were to go to the Gallatin Public Library today and say, Courtney Carroll, she worked here for a little while, what can you guys tell me about her beliefs? They would all tell you, oh, she's sold out for Jesus. You know, I mean, she has a strong faith, and it can't keep her from talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what she's about.
Right.
That's who she is, and she was a great employee here, and best we can tell, that's why.
Mm-hmm.
That should be the taste that you leave in the mouths of every place that you work for. And maybe it's a good taste, maybe it's a bad taste. The world hates Christ. They don't hate you, they hate you because they hate Christ, insofar as they do hate you, right? Regardless, whether it's sour to them or sweet, that should be the impression left by your time in any particular workplace.
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, would to God that everybody would leave that behind when they leave a workplace or when they're in a workplace. So, yeah, it's just about, you know, as you say, being honest and talking about what's on our mind. I think, you know, there's a principle out there. If you want to build relationships with people, quit talking about the weather and your latest sports team and talk about what's going on in their life. People will open up a lot more than you think if you will open up first. And that's how you build deep relationships, and that's how you get an opportunity to speak the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, this society is so spiritually destitute.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is absolutely the case that people are yearning and longing for some spiritual substance in their lives. And if you can be the person to deliver it to them, then praise God.
Amen.
I just want to hit on one more thing. I think we're about to wrap up here for today. Before I do you have anything else that you want to talk about?
Nothing coming to mind right at the moment.
I think this is a good place for us to end. There are a few verses that have to do with work that we haven't hit on yet. There are several times in the Bible, especially in Deuteronomy, where the Lord provides the, I suppose I should say, the framework under which He blesses our work. So you want to be productive, you want to be prosperous, the Lord tells you what you have to do for Him to bless the work of your hands. And it's very simple. You obey His commandments, and you're generous, freely and cheerfully, to the poor and needy. If you do those things, then the Lord will take whatever meager thing you can do with your hands, and He will multiply it. If you don't do those things, then the Lord will destroy the work that you do. So, generosity and obedience aren't expressly the subjects of this podcast, but I will say they have a strong bearing on how your work life ends up going. So obey the Lord's commands. Whatever He has blessed you with, hold it loosely in your hands, steward it for Him, give it to the poor and needy. That is true undefiled religion, as the Bible says, and that'll be good for your work.
Amen. Amen. I did think of one thing that I would like to mention that we haven't talked about. And we're probably remiss in not addressing this at some point in time, but some people have a workplace that's not in the workplace. It's at home. There are a lot of stay-at-home moms they have a job, they're just not getting a paycheck for it. Right? And so I just want to, number one, acknowledge that. And I want to do this too. If you're a stay-at-home mom, do not let anybody tell you that your value and your worth and what you're doing as a person is less important than someone who is out trying to become the CEO of the Fortune 500 company. There is nothing more important than raising godly children. And so, do not feel inferior in any way if you've taken that on, because quite honestly, the people that are not in the workplace that have chosen to stay home are oftentimes made to feel inferior. And I think it's because the people that are not staying home, want to not have that burden of, I'm not doing what I need to with my kids. And so there can be a push to make stay-at-home moms feel inferior in some way. And I'm not saying anything against moms at work. A lot of moms have to work. I understand that. And I think they're a great group as well. But just speaking specifically to the group that has chosen to stay home, a lot of the same principles that we have talked about apply to you as well. The thing about it is, when you're a stay-at-home mom, you don't have a boss per se saying, do this or do that. You have to be a lot more self-motivated and industrious on your own, and that's challenging. But obviously the Proverbs 31 woman is a great example.
Absolutely.
But you have to take the mindset of, just like a worker would at a job, I'm serving my household. I'm going to make my household a better place. I'm going to represent Christ well in this. If you are a stay-at-home mom and you teach your kids the Word of God and you raise them in a godly fashion and set forth a godly example to them, you have done the most magnificent thing that any human being can do.
That's right. And any great spiritual leader that you can think of, I guarantee you there's a great mom behind that person. And, I suppose we should say, just by way of a life update, since our last podcast...
Yeah, we should.
My first child was born.
Amen.
A boy named Robert. Now, what that means is, for our purposes here today, I have just witnessed Courtney go through the entire process of pregnancy and then birth, and now nursing and nurturing the child. And from witnessing all of that, I have just been blown away by how cool and how miraculous women's abilities is to do that. I think that it is the coolest thing ever, and it has just caused me to think, the fact that some people will forego this incredible ability that they have, this miraculous ability, in the name of having a career, just shows the degree to which wisdom has departed from this society. It makes my blood boil, the idea of someone criticizing or denigrating a stay-at-home mom as if she's doing something lesser than a mom who goes out and gets a job. Being a mother is one of the coolest jobs in the entire world. And if you are a mother and that is your full-time occupation, there's so much honor in that, and all the more if you do it the way the Bible teaches.
Yeah. And just let me say congratulations to you and Courtney on the birth of Robert.
Yeah. If you see some dark circles under my eyes, now you know why.
Andrew's not getting much sleep these days. And so, yeah, he's a wonderful child. Obviously our grandchild, our number 4 grandchild, second grandson. So yeah, just congratulations. It was a good job by all, and y'all doing a great job as new parents, still learning the ropes a little bit, but we're just grateful for a healthy baby, that Courtney's healthy, and as you say, you just have to marvel at the miracle of birth. What happens, just that whole process of bringing another human into the world, it's just amazing. And taking on that role to serve that child, to serve your family, is a very honorable thing, and we do not want in any way to diminish that when we're talking about work.
Yeah, absolutely. We just can't help talking about family on this podcast.
We certainly shouldn't.
No, yeah, I mean, it's what it's so important. I mean, it's so much of what our lives are about, and all the more, I would say. So I think with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us for our series on work. We hope it's been a blessing to you. Is there something that we forgot to talk about? Let us know in the comments down below. Let us know what we said that spoke to you, what your struggles are at work. We want to hear from you guys. We want to know what you're experiencing, what you're facing as you try to live out the word in your life every day. Until next time, God bless you, and don't forget to share, like, subscribe, whatever it is. So we'll see you later.